I recently made a terrarium using this vintage glass cloche, and I'm going to show you how I did it. The cloche has a wooden base, and I don't want to build directly onto this, as any humidity or water that drips onto the wood will damage it. So I measure up and find a ceramic dish, which luckily is a perfect fit. The next task is to assemble all of the tools and the equipment that I'm going to need for the build. I'll also need some heavier duty tools to cut the hardscape down to size. A handsaw would work, but this electric saw will make life a bit easier for me. I'll be using this cool piece of driftwood as the centerpiece for the display, but as you can see it's too big for the glass lid to fit. So I'm going to measure it and cut it down to the right size. After measuring and marking the pieces I want to cut, I do so using the electric saw. Needless to say, you have to be really careful with this as these tools can be quite dangerous. Some further cuts are needed, so I continue measuring, marking and cutting the wood to size. It's really important that you take your time during this process, as you don't want to cut too much of the wood off. Now that I've trimmed the piece of wood to roughly the right size and shape, I want to make these cut ends look a bit more natural, and I'm doing that by snipping away and pulling bits of wood off using the secateurs. This will make it look like the branches have snapped rather than being cut with a saw. I'll do a final test fit to make sure that the glass fits comfortably over the wood and there's plenty of space around the outside of the wood for any plants to grow. Using the electric saw has produced loads of sawdust, so I'm just going to hoover that up before we continue. The hardscape looks a little plain as it is, so I'm going to add some dragonstone pieces to make the structure more interesting. I want the piece of wood to look like it's the stump of a plant that's grown from a rocky outcrop, so I take some time positioning the stones in a way that looks natural. It's worth trying to align all the pieces of rock, so any markings on them run in the same direction. This will make it look much more natural. Now that I'm happy with the structure, I'm going to lock all the pieces together and stop them moving. To do this, I'm using small pieces of tissue paper, which I wedge between the contact points between the rock and the wood. I then add a small dab of super glue. This will soak into the tissue and form a really strong bond. Even with just a couple of contact points glued together in this way, you can see it's formed a really strong bond. I continue gluing further contact points together to make the structure even stronger. Here's a closer view of how this process works. Once again, it's important to take your time during this process. You want to make sure the finished product looks really natural, and it's quite good fun building this structure. Once this structure is finished, I'm going to fill some of the gaps with a blend of clay and cocoa coir. This will make it look like mud, with the rocks and roots emerging from it. Time for another test fit with a glass lid. Once again, I just want to make sure that everything fits comfortably and no parts of the structure are hanging out or are going to damage the glass. For the clay layer, I'm using some of this Soil Ninja clay. I'm going to pour it into this small pot and I'm going to break it down into smaller pieces. I'm just using the head of a hammer to try and crush the large particles till I can make them much smaller, almost a dust-like consistency. Once I've done that, I'm going to add a small amount of ground cocoa coir. This will make the clay look darker, and it will also help it retain moisture, which the plants will appreciate. I then add some water. It's best to do a little bit at a time so you don't make it too wet. I mix everything together by hand. This is quite messy. We're aiming for a consistency where you can roll the clay into a ball and it holds its shape, something like this. I'm going to gently press the clay into the exposed gaps between the pieces of rock and the wood. I'm using a small amount of clay each time and just gently working it in, trying to create a natural look. This can be quite a time-consuming, slow process, so I've sped the footage up for you. As well as filling the gaps between the rock and the wood, I'm also filling the gaps around the base of the structure where it meets the ceramic dish. I soon ran out of clay, so I mixed up another batch and continued adding it to the structure. As the clay starts to dry slightly, you might spot some areas where you've missed and other gaps that you need to fill. So take your time and continue working round and round the structure until you're happy with the finished result. I'm pretty happy with how this has turned out, but as you can see, I've made plenty of mess, so it's time to have a bit of a tidy up. To get an idea of how the finished display will look, I'm going to place the structure back into the cloche. And once again, I want to make sure that everything still fits, because it will be much easier to fix any problems at this stage than later once it's planted. Everything fits well, so it's time to start adding the plants. I've got one of my propagation boxes out, which has got plenty of cuttings I can use, as well as some really nice moss. First up, I'm going to add some of this oak leaf ficus. I really love this plant. It should root well into the clay, and it should start growing and climbing all over the structure. I'm using the tweezers just to gently push the ends of the plant into the clay where it will take root. I want to add a feature plant, and I've decided to use this cutting of a Begonia amphioxus. It's a striking plant that should do well in here as it loves warmth and humidity, which this terrarium will provide. Using the tweezers, I gently add it into a small gap between two pieces of rock. It should be really happy here. I'm also adding a few other cuttings from my propagation box. In time, these small plants should root and start to crawl all over the hardscape, creating a really nice natural look. With the main plants added, the next step is to add some moss. I have several different varieties of moss in this propagation box, so I get a few pieces of each to add to the display. The pieces of moss are gently placed into small gaps. In time, this moss should grow and start to cover more of the hardscape. The display looks a little sparse at the moment, but as the plants and the moss grow, they'll start to spread and everything will really fill out nicely. However, there is a gap at the top of the display on the vertical branch, and I'm going to add a small Tillandsia air plant to this. A small dab of superglue is added to the wood, and I then gently press the plant into position while the glue dries. And that's all of the planting completed. The The final step is to put the lid back on, sit back and watch the plants grow.